Watch this. Before, it's almost like her face goes back into her hair. Watch this after. Her face pops forward from the shadows in her hair. And that's not because the shadows became darker, it's because the shadows became cooler. And when those shadows become cooler, they recede, which makes the warm things pop forward. So her excitement is actually coming towards me now. This is the effect of even subtle color grading in your images. As a former painter and someone who has been a fine artist my entire life, I want to share with you what I feel is the best color tool ever in Photoshop. And not only am I going to teach you why it's so good and how to essentially work on your photographs like you're a painter with color, but I'll show you a tool that will make this so much easier for you. So let's just dive right in. Don't want to waste your time. The thing I want to talk about is the selective color adjustment layer. And I know what you're thinking already. You're like, Blake, selective color is so 1999. Isn't that where you would make a black and white image but then make one color pop out? Yes, that's old school selective color thinking, where you selectively make one color shine through on a black and white image. But that is not what the selective color adjustment layer is for in Photoshop, which might actually be a deterrent from people using it. The selective color adjustment layer. I'm going to pop this bad boy on. What you see from the top to the bottom is you have presets here. You can save presets if you'd like. I don't think they're necessarily helpful because as I work with images, I find that the color is all relative, and we'll get to relative versus absolute in a second here. But here you have all of your colors plus your whites, your neutrals, and your blacks. So this is a great tool for not only manipulating individual colors, but also color grading your white, neutral, and black areas, which we will discuss as well. And then here you see cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. And you might say to yourself, well, this is interesting. This is more like a CMYK tool, Blake. Are you in CMYK? Well, if I go to image and I go to mode, no, I'm working in RGB. So you're like, okay, well, we're in the RGB space, which is where we're typically used to working, but this is a CMYK tool. Why are you using this? Well, for the most part, I think a lot of people use the selective color adjustment layer when printing, so they can adjust the amount of ink or pigment that goes onto the paper that they're using. So if they have an issue with cyan not being quite as strong, they can go into selective color and make cyan stronger. I tend to use this more as a color grading and more like an artistic based tool rather than a technical tool. If you use it as a technical tool, which is a great technical tool, great. But I want to teach you more the artistic way to use a selective color adjustment layer to make any color the color you want it to be. What you're going to see here is the RGB CMY color wheel. This is what I call the digital color wheel, and many other people refer to it as the same. What that means is that we are not working in the painting space where red and green are opposites on the color wheel. In the digital world, we're working with red and cyan being opposites on the color wheel, which for some people who have studied color theory think I'm absolutely crazy for even teaching this stuff. But I will tell you, if you try to think about the painter's color wheel in a digital space, all of your colors are going to be wonky and funky. So we got to jump into this digital color wheel idea and humor me. So here's the deal with the color red. We are in the color red right now. That means that anything we do with these sliders right here is only going to affect the color red. So before we jump into actually moving these sliders around, let's talk about relative and absolute, because these are settings that I get asked about all the time. The basic concept between these, if you really want to think about this, relative is gradual, absolute is intense. If you need an intense adjustment, use absolute. If you want a gradual, more natural adjustment, use relative. So when we look at cyan here, if I'm in relative mode and I am in the color red, if I move this to the right, I'm going to add more cyan presence to the color red. Now, in the highest potency of the color red, you don't see that much of a difference, but here you do see this color right here as it changes and shifts. Okay, you also see that color shifting over here. What we're doing is we are making red less intense by adding the presence of cyan to it, which is the opposite on the color wheel. Okay, so everything that we look at here, if we move this to the right, we are making red more cyan. Now, if we want the opposite, we want red to become more intense, instead of thinking about increasing the saturation, because that's the last thing that I do when I'm working with my color. The last thing I will do is pop an HSL adjustment layer on here and hike up the saturation of a color. Because all that is doing is increasing the present intensity of that color using the saturation potential of that color. What it's not doing is assessing what colors are within that color that are keeping it from being more intense. That's where we're going to get at here. So if I were to move this to the left, it's going to do the opposite, because when we're looking at the color wheel here, what is opposite of the color cyan? It's the color red. So when we move this to the left, guess what happens? Our red gets more intense. It gets more vibrant. It gets more robust, more beautiful. Now, if we change this to absolute, that's where things get a little crazy here. So when we look at relative basically says, okay, let's take a look at the color red and the intensity of the cyan that's in that color red. When this is set to relative, it will take the percentage of cyan that is in the color red and gradually increase that percentage based off of the percentage that you're taking away or adding to it. If we change it to absolute, it says, hold on a second. I don't care that there's a relative amount of cyan in that color red. If you move this up, I'm going to give you cyan in the color red. I'm just going to let cyan just mix all day long in that color red. And now you see that when we change this to relative, we don't get quite that increase. The reason why is because if we look at this color red right here, there is not a whole lot of presence of cyan in this color red because it's the most vibrant potential of the color red that we could get. But when we change it to absolute, it doesn't care about the presence of red there. It says if there's even an inkling of cyan, I'm going to do my job. And that's what it does. So that's why it's easier to just think of these as gradual and intense. So for all intents and purposes, we are going to make this relative. And I usually, if you're asking, stick to the relative. Okay, I don't usually go into absolute unless I really need to force a color into a direction. But as a painter or fine artist would work, color is a gradual increase process. It's typically not something you want to work really fast with. It's something you want to work gradually and build up. Now, I've got example images that I'm going to share with you on this. Right now, we're just going over the basics of selective color. So now, if I were to move this to the right, we are going to put more cyan into the color red, which is going to make the color red less intense. We're looking at test swatches here, but what about the image? That's why I have an image in the background. As we move this up, you can see the oranges in the background here along this mountain get a lot less intense because we are telling more cyan to go into the presence of that color red, which is going to subdue that color red. So this is the important thing to realize here, is that when you're moving a color like the color red and you want to make it more intense, you're going to take the cyan color out of it. But if you want to subdue it, you're going to move it to the right to give it more cyan. Essentially what we're doing here to make a color more intense is to think about this in terms of color theory and think about things in terms of analogous colors versus complements. So in order to do that, we have to think about things in terms of complements and analogous, because that's really going to help you with color here. Complementary colors are any colors that are on the opposite side of the color wheel. So in this case, red and cyan are complements of one another. If we want to subdue red, we will want to increase the presence of cyan in that red, because it's on the opposite side of the color wheel and their relationship to one another. If we want to increase the intensity of that color red, we need to reduce the presence of cyan in the color red. I think of this like when I was a child and I would get in a fight with my brother. He's 3 years older than me, a lot taller than me. So what he would do, as soon as I would come in fight, I'd like swing, and I'm like, I just had so much intense rage to fight this older brother of mine. And you know what he did? Just like every big older brother would do. He would laugh and giggle at me as he put his hand on my forehead and just watched me swing underneath his arms. I couldn't do anything. That's essentially what's happening with your color. Sometimes your color wants to scream and break out, but it can't because the complement on the other side is holding it back. So as I talk about the example images, this idea of holding back or making more intense is going to be the kicker here. So the ways that we can make a color more intense outside of just adding more of itself to it is to look at the analogous colors around it. And analogous colors are any colors that are in close proximity to that color. So if we're looking at the color red here, if we were to go a wide analogous, we're looking at magenta and yellow as being the wide analogous colors that would help the color cyan against its counterpart and all of its buddies, blue and green and cyan. Now, if we do a more tighter analogous color scheme, orange and the blend of red and magenta, which would be like a red-violet, are going to be the colors that will help it out in close proximity. When we're working with selective color, though, we have to think about this more in the wide analogous stance. Because if we want red to get more intense, this is how I would do it. I would reduce the amount of cyan that's in the color red, and to make it even more strong, I would give it a little hint of magenta because that's close on the color wheel, and I would give it more yellow. That is going to make the red in this image overall more intense. And you can see that down here along the tree line, as well as in the mountains in the background. What also helps is when you want to make a color more intense is adding a little bit of black to it. That way it doesn't get that saturated effect. If you've ever gone in and just taken a hue saturation adjustment layer and hiked it up, you'll notice that the color just gets this fabricated brightness to it. Well, actually increasing intensity is going to come in when you use the analogous colors that are around it, and also by reducing the amount of the complement that's on the other side and adding a hint of black to it will make it a little bit more intense. If you want to make it brighter, you're going to move this the opposite way and you're going to add white to it, because the opposite of black is white. If we go in the negatives, we're going to white. If we go to the positives, we're going to black. I really wish that these sliders were color coded. It would make everyone's life so much easier. However, I've got a tool that will help you with that where you don't need to worry about that at all. So now let's look at this in practical application. This is the basics, the absolute basics of selective color. Let's take a look at an image like this, which is going to be your fall foliage image. The problem with this image in front of me is that the yellows are a little bit too orange in many cases, as that's what my eye sees. And I don't necessarily see that in the color yellow itself. Do you know where I'm seeing that? Actually in the color green. So in my color workflow, I do something called color correction, then color separation, then color grading. What I'm going to show you now is going to be more of a color separation technique. So what I want to do here is I'm going to go ahead and put on a selective color adjustment layer. And in the selective color adjustment layer, what is the main primary color that I'm trying to work on that I think is the problem here? Well, there's two of them really. It's going to be my yellows and it's going to be my greens. So let me go into the color yellow. So now that I'm in the color yellow, if I wanted to make yellow stronger, the first thing I'm going to do is just increase the presence of yellow within the color yellow. If I move this to the left, it's going to add blue to that yellow, which is, what's that going to do? Subdue the color yellow, because I'm looking at the complement of the color yellow, which is blue. So if I add blue to yellow, what happens to the yellow? It gets subdued. So I need to increase the presence of yellow within the color yellow. Now, I still feel like those yellows aren't quite the yellow that I want. Okay, so I'm going to start experimenting here to see, do I want them to be more of an orangish yellow? If I do, I'm going to move this to the right. Or do I want them to be more of a greenish yellow? Well, in the instance of fall foliage, which many people don't know that the selective color adjustment layer can be phenomenal for helping you with color separation with this, I'm going to want to make that a little bit more of that orange or reddish tint. Now I can say to myself, do I want those yellows to be a little bit more orange, or do I want them to be a little bit more green? And what I'm doing here is effectively mixing cyan into that color yellow to make them more on the green side rather than on the red side. What it's doing to the color green, though, you're like, wait, the greens are moving too. Well, that's because there's a lot of yellow presence in the color green. So if I want some type of balance here where I'm like, you know, I still want a little bit of that green to shine through, I can come through here and give it a little bit of cyan, which is going to make it feel more green. So what's happening here is the greens are looking more green. My yellows are getting a little bit more intense and a little bit more on the reddish side, but they're getting effectively better looking. So if I were to increase the brightness of those yellows, they will stand out more than the greens. So now let's go to the color green. And in the color green, let's see what happens if I make them a little bit more blue. So what I'm doing here is I'm moving this back and forth, and really the green is going to be back here. You see that? You can see it really back here pretty well. When I move this down, they get more blue and they kind of get more pushed away while the yellows start to pop forward more. But I'm going to make them a little bit more green by adding yellow to them, because if we look at our color wheel here, if I go to yellow in the color green, it is going to make green stronger because they are analogous colors. All right. If I go to the opposite side of the color wheel from the color green, any of these, it is going to subdue that color green. All right. So what I'm going to do here also is maybe make those greens more green by reducing the magenta presence that is within them. And then I can also make those greens a little bit more cyan. So now what I've done here is I've effectively separated out those colors so that the greens become more green, the yellow become more yellow, and they get the separation that they need for them to coexist in this image and actually look like good color work. This original doesn't look like good color work to me. It looks like the colors are all trying to be along the same color depth, so the greens and the yellows exist basically in the same color space. This might not look like a huge adjustment to you. Let me duplicate it so you can see the difference now. Okay, now when I duplicate it, you can really see the intensity of these colors coming through. Now, I only duplicated this for the sake of this tutorial so that you could see these colors being separated. In my work, I probably wouldn't want my colors to be this vibrant and this bright because they look oversaturated at this point. But I could get the best of both worlds by making that maybe 50%. Because what's happening here is this selective color layer on this image gave me a boost in the color throughout the whole image. Adding this selective color layer on the top of it boosted the color that we just boosted even more. Okay, now let's take a look at an image like this. But I'm not going to use selective color like you've seen before. I'm going to use my visionary panel. And in the visionary panel, there's a tab right here called color. Essentially what I've done is I've worked with my developer so that we could create sliders that would mimic the presence of color in an image like a painter would. So what I'm going to do is, it doesn't matter if I have a selective color adjustment layer selected, I can use these sliders and they'll work on it. If I don't have one selected, the minute I move a slider, it's going to automatically make one and it will allow that color to move in that direction. So when I increase the color yellow here, okay, I want you to look at this yellow here. Just moving this slider up and stopping it gave me plus 45 to my yellow, negative 14 to my magenta, and negative 14 to cyan. Moving this up in this direction is going to make the yellow more intense in my image using analogous colors and doing it proportionately to the amount that I move this slider. That's what makes this visionary panel so fantastic, is I have complete color control very quickly over all the colors in my image and even access to things like color grading. So what I'm doing in this is I'm reducing the intensity of the color green, increasing the intensity of the color yellow, and increasing the intensity of the color red throughout this image. Here's the before, here's the after. Okay, I purposely push these further than I really normally would. That's so that you can see them on the video. It can be very difficult to see this color change unless we over exaggerate it. Now, the other beautiful part of this is I didn't really touch on it when I was talking about the example image, but we also have color grading here. And what I can do is I can take a look at the black areas in the image, the neutral areas in the image, and the white areas in the image. And these sliders are specifically for adding color temperature in very specific places, which you cannot do in Adobe Camera Raw or Lightroom very easily, but it makes it very simple in Photoshop using the visionary panel. One thing that most painters will do to make their dark areas recede away from the viewer is make them cooler and make the neutral areas warmer. And they do that just instinctually as they're painting because they know that cool colors recede and warm colors come forward. So what I can do here is I can add a little bit of blue to those shadow areas and a little bit of warmth to those neutral areas, okay? Maybe a little bit too much to those neutrals because it already has quite a bit, but maybe even a little bit more blue to those dark areas. Now, slightly exaggerated, but look at the before and look at the after. The color is where the color needs to be. The reds are where the reds need to be. The yellows are separated in the way that they need to be, and so are the greens. Greens are separated from yellow, yellow separated from green, and reds can exist in their own space without relying heavily upon yellow, and yellow can do the same without relying heavily upon red because we've separated out those colors using their analogous buddies to help them push away from their complementary counterparts. Now let's try this on a portrait image. I found this on Adobe Stock and I thought her excitement was great. But what I noticed here is, like, if we're photographers and we're really excited about fall foliage, I don't think dead brown foliage is the thing to show here. So the color grade on this image is overly brown. And you won't see this right away, but watch as I start to add and subtract color from very specific areas using the visionary panel and the color sliders. The first thing I'm going to do is say, looking at her hair and also her pants, it seems as if they are very brown and have more of a warm tone to them. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to add blue to those dark areas. And look at how that helps some of those darker areas get pushed back. So her exuberant face actually starts to come forward. This is a color depth thing. Watch this. Before, it's almost like her face goes back into her hair. Watch this after. Her face pops forward from the shadows in her hair. And that's not because the shadows became darker, it's because the shadows became cooler. And when those shadows become cooler, they recede, which makes the warm things pop forward. So her excitement is actually coming towards me now. This is the effect of even subtle color grading in your images. Now what I'm going to do is just add a little bit of warmth to those neutral areas. And then let's take a look at the colors here. The magenta in the background, or that pink in the background, is not very strong. So let's make it a little bit stronger. All right, now the magenta is getting a little bit more intense. I actually feel some excitement from this image now. Let's take a look at the reds. The reds are going to be where her skin tones are. So if I bring these up too high, it's going to really make those reds look really unnatural and those skin tones are not going to look good. So I'm actually going to reduce that just a slight hint, just reduce that just a little bit to take some of the edge off of that vibrance in her skin tones. You can already see it happening there in her neck area. Now we'll take the yellows, move that up just a little bit and see what that's going to give us. Okay, so it's all right. I'll move that right about there just to get a little bit more warmth in those yellows. It's looking a lot more natural here. Now these leaves are dead. They're dead and brown. So let's actually go to our background layer here, use the quick selection tool and just trace around this. I'm just going to trace around this because I'm using the lasso tool for this. I'll trace around there, press and hold shift and trace around this one. Okay. And now I'm going to make myself a new selective color adjustment layer. And this one is going to have the mask for those leaves. So now what I'm going to do is just increase the red in those leaves to make them vibrant, increase the yellows in those leaves, and then maybe give a little bit of blue to the shadows there to actually make it look like these leaves are separated from one another, and maybe a little bit of more warmth in those neutral areas. Okay, so now let's take a look at this image. And here's the before, very brown color graded. Now, the brown is a visually appealing brown for the imagery that is here, but we don't have good color separation between the objects. Here we have perfect color separation, yet still happen to maintain that brown color grade, but not make it overly brown so that everything just feels brown. This is the power of using selective color. It can be a meticulous thing, and some people could say, wow, you did a whole lot of work for a little bit of effect. And that could be true, but when you're a fine artist and you're really trying to push the mold of color, and when you truly understand how those colors are going to affect the individual, especially warm and coolness, this is the best tool in Photoshop for making subtle and even very strong changes. The sliders in this visionary panel are so unique and something I cannot live without in my workflow now. If you're interested in the visionary panel, please click this link here or the link in the description below. Thank you very much for taking the time to watch this. I sincerely hope you enjoyed it. And if you haven't done so already, please consider subscribing. I like to take difficult things in Photoshop and make them seemingly simple so you can use them in your workflow today.